I signed my house over to my neighbor, the woman who brought me bread when I couldn't stand, and left my own daughter with nothing but the debt she deserved. Let me tell you exactly how I got there. 53 years I lived in that house on Maple Creek Road. I painted every wall myself. I refinished those oak floors on my hands and knees the summer after my husband Raymond passed, because I needed something to do with my hands besides cry. That house was not just property. It was every morning I woke up alone and chose to keep going anyway. Every window I washed, every pipe I fixed, every winter I survived. The county assessor came by in the spring of the year I turned 71 and told me, very matter-of-factly, that the property had appreciated to just under $2 million. I remember nodding at him like that number meant something ordinary, like the price of milk. I had no idea that number was going to become the thing that revealed exactly who my daughter Linda truly was. But before I tell you about the notary she brought to my door, before I tell you what she said to my face while she thought I was too weak to remember, I need to ask you something directly. Do you believe a mother is obligated to give everything she has to her children, even when those children are quietly, patiently waiting for her to die? I want you to think about that. Write your answer in the comments, because what I went through will either shock you or, and this is the part that truly frightens me, it will not shock you at all. It will sound familiar. Because I think more of you know this story than any of us would like to admit. My name is Margaret Eloise Calloway. I was born on the 14th of March, 1952, in a small town in Ohio that no longer exists in any meaningful way. The factory closed, the young people left, the diner became a dollar store, and then nothing at all. I grew up understanding that you did not waste, you did not complain, and you did not burden other people with your pain. My mother ironed shirts at 3 cents apiece. My father worked 2 jobs until his heart gave out at 59. I was raised on the faith that sacrifice was the same thing as love, and for most of my adult life I did not question that equation. I married Raymond Calloway in the summer of 1974. He was a good man, not a dramatic man, not the kind of man who made speeches or brought flowers for no reason, but the kind of man who got up at 5 every morning for 31 years without complaint, who fixed your car before you knew it needed fixing, who held your hand in the hospital without needing to be asked. We had Linda in 1978 and then my son David 2 years after her. We raised them in that house on Maple Creek Road. We put money away in a coffee can above the refrigerator when the bank account ran dry. We went without vacations, without new furniture, without the little luxuries that other families seem to accumulate without effort. But the house was ours, fully paid off by the time Linda turned 12. That was the accomplishment I was most proud of in my entire life. Handing Raymond that final mortgage receipt and watching him smile in the particular way he smiled when something mattered to him, but he didn't have words for it. Raymond died in the spring of 2009. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that gives you almost no warning and absolutely no mercy, from diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks. 11 weeks to say goodbye to the person who had been my entire compass for 35 years. I will not describe those weeks in detail because some grief is too private for stories, but I will tell you this. Linda did not come home until the last 4 days. She called, she sent a card, she said she had a conference she couldn't miss, and then another conflict, and then she was very, very sorry, but she would be there as soon as she could. David drove up from Tennessee and slept on the couch and held his father's hand and cried without embarrassment. Linda arrived with her roller suitcase and her laptop bag and spent most of her visit on the phone in the kitchen. She did not cry at the funeral. She told me afterward that she had learned to process grief in a healthier way. I did not say anything. I was too tired, and I genuinely believed, that people express loss differently, and perhaps she was simply someone who needed privacy for her pain. That was the first story I told myself to protect her. It would not be the last. In the years after Raymond died, I settled into a new kind of life. Quieter. Smaller in its dimensions, but not unhappy. I kept a garden. I volunteered at the library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, helping children learn to read, which gave me a sense of usefulness that I had not expected to need so badly. I walked every morning at 6:30 down Maple Creek Road to the old mill, path and back, 2 miles exactly, which my doctor said was exactly right for my blood pressure and my grief, though she was wise enough to understand that those two things were connected. I was not a burden on anyone. I was not calling my children every day asking for attention. I was a woman making her own way through the back half of her life with as much grace as she could manage. Linda lived in Chicago. She had built herself a significant life there, a condominium on the 34th floor of a building downtown. a career in financial consulting that she described in terms I never fully understood, a social life I knew mostly through photographs posted online where she always looked beautiful and slightly unreachable. She called on Sundays, usually for about 12 minutes, sometimes less. She remembered my birthday, though the card usually arrived 2 days late. She did not ask about my health in any specific way. It was always, "How are you feeling, Mom?" delivered. Quickly, the way you deliver a sentence you don't want an actual answer to. I told her I was fine. I was almost always fine. David called more often and for longer, but he had 3 children and a business that was always almost failing or almost thriving, and I did not want to be another weight in his life. He visited twice a year, Thanksgiving, when his wife's family was unavailable, and a weekend in July that we had established as a quiet tradition, just the two of us and his oldest daughter, who had inherited Raymond's particular kind of gentleness. Those visits were the best days of my later years. I will not pretend otherwise. Now I need to tell you about Sylvia Novak. And I need you to understand something before I do. I did not set out to make Sylvia Novak my family. That is not a decision you make sitting down with a plan. It is something that happens in the accumulation of small moments, in the space left by the people who should have been there and were not. Sylvia had moved into the yellow house across the street, the Hendersons' old place, in the spring of 2015. She was 63 then, a retired schoolteacher, originally from Wisconsin, recently widowed herself, with a daughter in Portland who called often but visited rarely. She was not a dramatic woman. She was not someone who inserted herself. She introduced herself the week she moved in, brought over a coffee cake she had made herself, and we talked for 20 minutes on my front porch about nothing in particular. The neighborhood, the maple trees, the way the light changed in late afternoon on this particular stretch of road. I liked her immediately in the uncomplicated way you like someone who is simply what they appear to be. We became neighbors in the real, old-fashioned sense of the word. She would knock and ask if I needed anything when she was going to the grocery store. I would bring her tomatoes from my garden in August, more than either of us could eat. We walked together sometimes on my morning route. We watched a television program on Wednesday evenings that we had both started watching separately and discovered we were watching in common. It was not a dramatic friendship. It did not announce itself. It simply grew, the way certain plants grow, without fuss, without performance, putting down roots while you're looking somewhere else. In the autumn of 2018, I had a small stroke. I say small because that is what the doctors called it, a transient ischemic attack, which apparently means the brain signals stuttered for a moment but did not stop. I lost feeling in my left hand for about 40 minutes. I was in my kitchen when it happened, and I sat very still at the table until it passed, because I was frightened in a way I had never been frightened before. The fear was not of death exactly. I had watched Raymond die, and I no longer feared death with the animal panic I had felt in my younger years. The fear was of dependency, of becoming a version of myself that needed to be managed, scheduled, handled. I called my doctor. She sent me to the hospital. They ran tests for 2 days and sent me home with new medication, a list of restrictions, and a very calm recommendation that I consider whether I should be living alone. I called Linda from the hospital. She answered on the third ring. She said, "Oh my God, Mom," in a way that sounded genuinely alarmed, and then she said she would look at flights. She called back 2 hours later to say that the earliest she could come was the following weekend, but that she would absolutely be there, and in the meantime I should call my doctor if anything changed. She did not come the following weekend. She came 11 days later for 3 days, and spent a significant portion of that time on her laptop at my kitchen table with a look of concentrated distraction that I had come to recognize as her default expression. She told me I seemed fine. She left a list of phone numbers on the refrigerator. She said I should really think about one of those medical alert devices, the ones you wear around your neck. She hugged me at the door, and I could feel how ready she was to leave. Sylvia had been at the hospital the second day. She had heard from a neighbor that I had been taken by ambulance. Word travels fast on quiet streets, and she had come quietly with a bag containing a book she thought I might like, a small container of her chicken soup, and no expectation whatsoever that I owe her anything for being there. She sat with me for 3 hours. She did not talk too much. She asked the right questions and then was silent while I answered them, which is rarer than it sounds. When I was discharged, she drove me home. When I got back to my house and sat down in my own kitchen and felt the specific relief of familiar walls around me, I started crying in the helpless way you cry when you have been holding yourself together too long. Sylvia sat across the table from me and did not try to stop it or fix it or explain it away. She poured me tea. She let me cry. That was the moment, if I am being precise. That was when I understood something about what Sylvia Novak was to me that I had not had words for until then. The next 2 years were an education in my own body's betrayal. The stroke, small as it was, left certain things changed. My balance was not what it had been. I tired more easily. My left hand had a tremor that appeared without warning and disappeared the same way, unreliable and humiliating. My doctor adjusted my medications twice and added a third specialist to my growing collection of physicians. I was not an invalid. I was not helpless. But I was no longer the woman who refinished oak floors on her hands and knees, and I had to find a new understanding of myself that I resisted for longer than I should have. During this period, during the 2 years between my stroke and the winter I turned 70, Linda called on Sundays, as she always had, for approximately the same duration. She did not visit more often. She did not offer to come. She asked regularly, with a particular careful casualness, whether I had thought about making arrangements, which I understood was her way of asking whether I had thought about my will, my estate, the house. She suggested more than once that we should have a conversation with a financial advisor about the most efficient way to handle the property when the time came. I told her each time that I had a will, that everything was in order, that she did not need to worry. I told her this with a calmness I did not entirely feel, because something in the way she asked the question was beginning to press on a bruise I had not known was there. Sylvia, during those same 2 years, brought me bread. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like a small thing, like a detail I am adding for sentiment, but I mean it precisely and literally. When my tremor was bad, when I could not manage the particular dexterity that baking required, Sylvia brought me bread she had made herself twice a week, a simple white sandwich loaf with a slightly thick crust that was exactly what I wanted. She did not make a ceremony of it. She knocked, handed it over, sometimes came in for tea, sometimes did not. She drove me to my Thursday appointments when I was no longer fully confident in my own driving. She noticed, without being told, when I had not been out in 2 days, and she would appear at the door with some small excuse. She had made too much soup, she had found a book she thought I would want. She did not report on my condition to my children. She did not insert herself into my medical decisions. She was simply present in the specific way that presence becomes the most important thing in the world when you are frightened and aging, and quietly aware that the people who are supposed to love you most are calculating the square footage of your house. I want to stop here and make sure you understand what I am not saying. I am not saying Linda was a monster. I am not saying she had no good qualities, no moments of genuine warmth, no real love for me somewhere under the calculation. I carried her in my body and raised her with everything I had, and there are memories of her, young Linda, 7 years old and fierce, 12 and tender, 19 and trying so hard, that I hold without anger. What I am saying is that somewhere between that girl and the woman who drove up to my house that Wednesday in November with a notary public in the passenger seat, something had rotted, and I had been refusing to smell it for years. I need to tell you about the Wednesday in November, but first I need to tell you what happened in the weeks before it, because the Wednesday in November only makes sense in context, and the context is uglier than the day itself. I had been unwell. Not dramatically, not in the way that requires ambulances, but in the grinding, persistent way that signals to anyone paying attention that the machinery is slowing. I had lost weight I could not afford to lose. I was sleeping 12 hours and waking tired. My appetite had become unreliable. My doctor had ordered a series of tests, and I was in the process of waiting for results, which is one of the most suspended, disorienting states a person can inhabit. I had told Linda about the tests. I had told her they were likely precautionary, which was what my doctor had said, but that I was having them done, and that I would know more in 2 weeks. Linda called the next day, then the day after. 3 days in a row, more contact than I had received in the preceding 6 weeks combined. She called with a bright, particular concern in her voice that I recognized, because I had a mother too, and I know what a performance of concern sounds like when the performer has not quite found the right pitch. She asked how I was, feeling. She asked if I needed anything. She asked, on the third call, whether I'd given any thought to perhaps having someone look at the house. Not to sell it, she was quick to say, just to have it assessed, just to have everything organized, just so that when the time came, and here she paused delicately, there would be no confusion or delay. I said I would think about it. That night I did not sleep. I lay in Raymond's side of the bed, which I'd never stopped thinking of as his side even after 14 years, and I stared at the ceiling and I felt something I can only describe as a clarification, like a lens adjusting, like a photograph developing in a chemical bath and becoming, for the first time, precisely what it had always been. I thought about Linda calling 3 days in a row after learning that I was having tests. I thought about the 12-minute Sunday calls. I thought about Raymond's last weeks and the conference she could not miss. I thought about the look on her face when the county assessor had visited and she had happened to be there, the way her eyes had changed when he said the number, the way she had said wow very softly, as if to herself. I got up at 3 a.m. and I made tea, and I sat at my kitchen table in the dark, and I thought with a clarity that frightened me about what I actually knew versus what I had chosen not to see. And what I knew, what I had always known, what I had refused to formalize into a thought, because formalizing it would have made it real, was that my daughter had been doing a particular kind of math for years. The math of what I owned minus what I might spend before I died. The math of which she would get and how long she would have to wait. My blood ran cold in that kitchen at 3 a.m, and it did not warm back up. Sylvia found me still at the table at 6:30. She had seen my kitchen light and knocked. She knew my routine. She knew I did not leave lights on, through the night, and when I opened the door, she looked at my face and did not ask what had happened. She simply came in. She made fresh tea. She sat across from me, and after a long time of quiet, she said, "You've figured something out." I told her what I had figured out. I told her the whole of it, the calls, the timing, the assessor, Raymond's death and the conference, the question about arrangements asked with that particular careful casualness more times than I could count. I told her about the 12-minute Sunday calls and the 11 days before she came after my stroke. I talked for almost 2 hours, and when I was done, I felt simultaneously lighter and more desolate than I had in years. Sylvia did not rush to reassure me. She did not say Linda probably meant well, or maybe I was reading too much into it, or daughters are complicated. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "What do you want to do?" That question, those 5 words, I turned them over in my mind for weeks. What did I want to do? I want you to understand that at this point I had no plan. I had no scheme of revenge, no crafted strategy. I had only the slow, dawning recognition that I was an elderly woman with a significant asset and a daughter who had been treating me, kindly, carefully, with the performance of love, as a problem to be managed until I produced the inheritance. And I was trying to decide what, if anything, I was going to do about that. The Wednesday arrived before I had reached any decision. It was the 4th Wednesday of November, just before Thanksgiving. I remember that precisely because I had been planning to ask Linda to come for the holiday. I had been composing that invitation in my head for 2 weeks, trying to find the version of it that would reach her, that would bring her back to the table. I remember the sky that morning was the specific pewter gray of late autumn in Ohio, and the maple in my front yard had held on to a few last brown leaves that trembled in the wind without falling. I was in my kitchen eating toast. I had managed toast, which was a reasonable morning, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I looked out the window, and I saw Linda's car, which I recognized immediately, the white foreign sedan she had bought 2 years ago and mentioned twice in a tone suggesting she expected me to comment on its cost. I had not been told she was coming. She had not called. It was a Wednesday morning, and she had not mentioned a visit on Sunday's call, and I had not spoken to her since. I felt something tighten in my chest that was not my heart exactly, but was adjacent to it. She got out of the driver's side. She was dressed well, in the way she was always dressed when she wanted to project competence and authority. A dark coat, low heels, her hair arranged rather than casual. She looked like someone arriving at a meeting. That was the first wrong note. And then the passenger door opened, and a man got out, a man I did not know, in a gray suit, carrying a leather document bag. He walked around the car to stand beside Linda with the particular deliberate neutral expression of someone performing a professional function. My blood, and I have used this phrase before, but I need you to understand I am not using it figuratively. My blood genuinely ran cold. Not because I did not know what was happening, but because I did know what was happening, and the knowing of it while watching it happen through my own kitchen window was a different kind of cold than the 3 a.m. kind. This was the cold of something confirmed, of something you hoped was wrong and wasn't. I did not go to the door immediately. I sat at my kitchen table for a moment, perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a full minute, and I breathed. I looked at the half-eaten toast on my plate. I thought of Raymond, who in moments of difficulty had a way of becoming very still and very quiet until he knew exactly what he needed to say. I tried to borrow that from him. Then I went to the door. Linda's face when I opened it was arranged into a particular expression, warm concern, the performance of it refined over years. She said, "Mom, surprise? I wanted to come see you." And she hugged me, which she did not always do, and the hug was very slightly too long in the way that rehearsed gestures often are. Then she stepped back and gestured toward the man in the gray suit and said, "This is Mr. Fitch. He's a notary. I just thought while I was here, since we've been talking about getting things organized." I said, "We have not been talking about getting things organized." She paused. The performance flickered for a moment, just a moment, and then rearranged itself. She said, "Mom, I'm just trying to help. With your health situation, I think it's really important that we have everything in place so there's no—" I said, "Come inside then, both of you. I'll make tea." I want you to hold on to what happened next, because what happened in my kitchen that morning is the thing I have replayed more times than I can count. Not with pain now, but with a cold, clear satisfaction that I have had to examine for its morality and have decided is earned. I made tea. I was very calm. I set 3 cups on the table and I sat down across from Linda and Mr. Fitch, and I asked Mr. Fitch pleasantly what documents he had brought for me to sign. He produced from his leather bag several papers. He explained them with the careful, slightly overloud diction people sometimes use with the elderly, as though my age were a form of hearing loss. The documents were a power of attorney, giving Linda authority over my financial and medical decisions, and a deed transfer prepared to facilitate the eventual transfer of the property at the time of my death. Both documents had been prepared in advance. Both had blanks for my signature. Both were, in the words Mr. Fitch used, entirely standard and for my protection. I looked at the documents for a long time. I looked at my daughter, who was watching me with the bright, careful expression of someone waiting for a cue, and I felt in that moment an emotion I did not expect. Not anger, not grief. Something colder and more final than either of those. A kind of completion. I said, "Linda, when did your father die?" She blinked. She said, "Mom, what does that—" I said, "How many weeks between his diagnosis and the funeral?" She said, "I don't see what this has to do with—" I said, 11 weeks. You came in week 10. You were on the phone for most of it." I said it without heat, without raised voice, just as a recitation of fact, the way you might read a grocery list. "After my stroke, you came 11 days later. Last month, when I told you I was having tests, you called 3 days in a row, the only 3 consecutive days you've called since your father died. And on the 3rd call, you asked about the house." I looked at Mr. Fitch, who had developed the expression of a man who would very much like to be somewhere else. "Were you aware," I said to him, "that I have not agreed to have these documents prepared? That I was not consulted?" There was a silence in my kitchen that had the quality of a held breath. Linda said, "Yeah, Mom, I am trying to protect you." I said, "No, you are trying to protect your inheritance." And then I said, the thing I had not planned to say, the thing that came up from somewhere below planning. "And I'm afraid you've miscalculated." I asked them both to leave. Mr. Fitch was gone before his tea was cold. Linda stood in my doorway for a long time and said things I will not repeat here in their entirety. There were accusations about ingratitude, about how much she had sacrificed, about how I was clearly not well and was making decisions I would regret. There was a moment when she said, with a particular fury that stripped all performance from her face, "Do you have any idea what that house is worth?" And I said quietly, "Yes, I do. Do you?" She left. I stood in my doorway and watched the white sedan back out of my driveway and turn down Maple Creek Road, and I want to be honest about this, I felt terrible. I felt the specific devastation of a truth you have known for a long time, finally being spoken aloud in your own kitchen, between you and your daughter, with a notary as witness. I went back inside. I sat at my table. I did not cry, which surprised me. I was past the kind of grief that produces tears. I was in a different territory entirely. I called David that evening. He answered immediately, and when I told him what had happened, there was a silence on his end of the line that told me 2 things simultaneously. First, that he had not known Linda was going, and second, that he was not entirely surprised. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry." He said it simply, without deflection, and it was the most useful thing anyone said to me that day. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was. I told him I was going to make some changes, and he said, "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." I believed him. I still believe him. Now I need to tell you about the conversation I had with my attorney, Robert Kessler, the week after Thanksgiving. Robert had been handling my legal matters since Raymond was alive, a soft-spoken man in his mid-60s with the particular patience of someone who has sat across from people in the worst moments of their lives for 40 years. I called him the Thursday after Linda's visit and said I needed to talk about my estate, and he said, "I've been expecting this call." I did not ask him what he meant by that. Some things do not need elaboration. I drove to his office on a gray Tuesday morning. I had decided I was still driving, at least for now, at least for this. And I sat across from him at his desk, covered in the organized clutter of decades, of work, and I told him what I wanted to do. I told him calmly and in full, and when I was done, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "Margaret, are you certain?" I said, "Robert, I have been certain since 3 o'clock in the morning on a night in October. I have spent 6 weeks testing the certainty. I am certain." He said, "All right," and then he began to explain to me the mechanics of what I was proposing, which were not, it turned out, as complicated as I had feared. A property can be transferred by deed during the owner's lifetime. There are tax implications, which Robert explained in careful detail, the numbers of which I will give you in their full form, because I want you to understand the scale of what was moved. The house was valued at $1,940,000 at that time. The gift tax threshold for an individual in that year was $12 million, which meant that a direct transfer to a non-family member would be subject to gift. Tax calculations at rates Robert described with the specificity of a man who had done these calculations many times. We spent 2 hours going through the structure of the transfer, how to do it legally, how to do it in a way that would hold up against a challenge, how to document the consideration and the intent. Robert had questions. I had answers for all of them. But before I tell you what was in that final deed, before I tell you what happened when Linda found out, and what she did, and what she found when she arrived with a different lawyer to contest it, I need to do something. I need to ask you to consider subscribing to this channel, because this is only the first part of a story that has several more turns, and the most important one is still coming. The part about what Linda found in my house after the transfer, what she had not expected, what changed everything she thought she knew. Check that you're subscribed, because I will not be repeating what comes next. Let me tell you about the morning I signed the deed. It was a Tuesday in the second week of February, one of those winter mornings when the sky is white rather than gray, when the light is flat and cold, and the world looks like a photograph of itself rather than the real thing. I had asked Sylvia to come with me to Robert's office, not because I needed support. I was past needing support in the conventional sense, but because it seemed right that she should be there. She was the person I was giving the house to, and she deserved to understand what that meant with the full weight of the moment, not as a later surprise or a document in the mail. I had told Sylvia 2 weeks before what I intended to do. She had said no. That is the first thing I want you to understand about Sylvia Novak. Her first response when I told her I was planning to transfer my home to her was to refuse. She said it was too much. She said she had not done anything that warranted a $2 million gift. She said I was being, and I remember her exact word, extravagant. I told her she was wrong about what she had and had not done. We had that conversation twice. The second time I showed her a list I had made, a literal, written list of every time she had driven me somewhere, every meal she had brought me, every morning she had knocked to check on me, every hour she had sat with me in a hospital room or a kitchen or a difficult silence. The list was 4 pages long. I had documented it as precisely as I could. Dates, times, what was brought, what was done. I gave her the list and I said, "Tell me this is not worth a house." She read the 4 pages without speaking. When she was done, her eyes were wet in the way that does not result in dramatic crying, but is somehow more specific and more real. She said, "Margaret." That was all. Just my name. And I said, "Yes, I know." In Robert's office on that white February morning, we signed the documents together. Robert was thorough and unhurried. He explained every clause to both of us. He made clear to Sylvia what she was receiving and what the implications were, the taxes, the costs, the responsibility. He made clear to me what I was giving and what I retained. I retained a life estate, which meant that I would continue to live in the house for the remainder of my life, with full rights to the property, and upon my death the full ownership would transfer to Sylvia outright. This is important because it is the thing that Linda's lawyer later challenged, and Robert's paperwork made unchallengeable. The life estate was properly documented, properly witnessed, properly filed. There was no ambiguity, there was no loophole. I had signed the house to Sylvia Novak on a white Tuesday morning in February, and the thing was done. I felt, walking out of Robert's office into the cold February air, something I have struggled to name adequately. It was not triumph exactly, though there was something hard and bright at its edge that was adjacent to triumph. It was not relief, though there was relief in it. The closest word I have found is integrity, the specific feeling of a life brought into alignment with its own values, of an action that corresponds exactly to what you believe, of a document signed in a lawyer's office that represents not just a legal transfer, but a moral one. I had taken the thing that was supposed to be the trophy of my daughter's patience, and I had given it instead to the person who had earned it. Sylvia and I went to a diner afterward and had eggs and coffee and talked about nothing in particular. The winter, a book she was reading, whether the maple in my front yard would need trimming in the spring. We did not discuss the enormity of what had just been signed. We did not need to. Now, let me tell you what happened when Linda found out. I did not tell her myself. I want to be honest about that. I had Robert send her a certified letter, which he did on the Friday of the same week, informing her as a courtesy that the property at the Maple Creek Road address had been transferred by deed, and that as a result the asset was no longer part of my estate. Robert was careful about what the letter said and did not say. He is very good at precision. It contained no explanation, no apology, no editorial. It was a legal notification delivered with the dry accuracy of a fact. Linda called me 37 minutes after that letter was signed for, according to the tracking number. I know this because I was watching the tracking number on my phone with the focused attention of someone who knows a storm is coming and wants to see the exact moment it lands. I answered the phone. She was not composed. That performance I had watched her maintain for years, the careful concern, the bright voice, the warmth deployed with strategic precision, it was entirely gone. What was left underneath it was something rawer and uglier, and I want to be fair to her and say that it was also something genuinely wounded because I think some part of her had believed, in some recess below the calculation, that I loved her in a way that would override everything else. She said things that were very loud. She said I had lost my mind. She said the stroke had affected my judgment. She used that specific phrase more than once, with the deliberate repetition of someone who is also building a legal argument. She said she would contest it. She said she had a right to that house, that she had a right to something after everything she had done. I asked her quietly what she had done. There was a silence. Then she said, "I'm your daughter." And I said, "Yes, you are." I will not tell you that I did not feel pain in that conversation because I did. I felt pain that had been accumulating for years, and that was now simply out in the open, which is not the same as new pain but feels sharp in its own way. I felt the pain of a woman who had wanted a different daughter and had been pretending for too long that she had one. But beneath the pain, below it holding it, was that hard, bright thing that was adjacent to triumph, the clarity of a person who has finally, after years of performing a different story, told the truth. Linda did engage a lawyer. She filed a challenge to the deed transfer within 4 weeks. Her argument rested primarily on 2 claims. First, that my mental capacity at the time of signing was compromised by my health situation, and second, that the transfer had been made under undue influence, specifically that Sylvia Novak had manipulated an elderly and vulnerable woman into giving her a house worth nearly $2 million. Robert was prepared for both challenges. He had, in his characteristic thoroughness, secured 3 independent assessments of my mental competency in the weeks before the signing, all of which found me to be fully competent and capable of making legal decisions. He had, for documentation of Sylvia's history of care, not as a strategic calculation but because Robert is a man who documents everything. The 4-page list I had given Sylvia became, in slightly different form, a document in the legal file. The challenge took 11 months. 11 months of letters and depositions and court dates that I attended in my best coat with my best posture, because I was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of appearing diminished. During those 11 months, Linda called me twice, both times to say things about the legal proceedings that I was not permitted, by Robert's instruction, to respond to in any meaningful way. I said very little. I listened. I waited. The challenge was dismissed. The deed held. Sylvia Novak was confirmed as the owner of the house at Maple Creek Road to take full possession upon my death, with me retaining my life estate until that time. I want to tell you what I heard from David during those 11 months, because David is not a small part of this story, and I have perhaps given him too little space in it. David called me every week during the legal process. He had, when Linda first announced the challenge, a difficult conversation with her that he described to me only obliquely. He is a private man, but from which I gathered that he had been very clear about his position. He did not support the challenge. He told Linda this directly. He told me that whatever I had decided to do with my property was my right, and that he would not participate in a legal action against his own mother. Linda, from what I understand, did not speak to David for approximately 4 months following that conversation. David, from what I understand, found a way to survive that. He visited me that July, as usual, with his oldest daughter. We did not talk about the legal proceedings for the first 2 days. On the third day, sitting on my porch in the late afternoon light with the maple throwing long shadows across the yard, he said, "Mom, was it worth it?" I thought about it for a genuine moment. I said, "Ask me again in 10 years. He nodded. He understood what I meant. Some verdicts are not delivered in the immediate aftermath. Let me tell you about what else Linda discovered when she arrived at the house during the legal proceedings. She had come, with her lawyer, to conduct what she described as an inventory of the property, an assessment of my possessions, the contents of the house, the assets that might be separate from the house itself and therefore still claimable. She arrived on a Monday morning in April, and I let her in, as I am required by law to do as long as the life estate is in place, because this is my home and I'm not afraid of anyone in it. She went through the house systematically. Her lawyer had a clipboard. I sat in the kitchen and had tea. I let them look. I had nothing to hide, and I knew what they were going to find, and I knew what they were not going to find, and the knowing of both of those things was its own particular satisfaction. What they found was a comfortable, modest home, entirely ordinary in its contents, with a great many books and a reasonable amount of furniture, and nothing of unusual financial value. No savings account they could attach to the property. No cash hidden in mattresses, which I think they half expected given the age and the stereotype. No investments, no bonds, no accounts that hadn't been fully disclosed. What they did not find, what Linda had apparently believed was there, was a second significant asset. Linda had, at some point, formed the belief that Raymond had left a separate investment account, held in both our names, that had been accruing for decades. She had mentioned this account to David, apparently, as one of the reasons she was so focused on the estate. She had calculated, I do not know where she got her figures, whether from guesswork or from fragments of conversation overheard over the years, that this account held somewhere between $250,000 and $400,000. The account had existed. Raymond had opened it in 1988 with modest initial funds, a disciplined amount set aside from his salary every month. It had grown over the years to a sum that Raymond and I had discussed in the private language of people who have built something together and know what it cost. In the final year of Raymond's life, as it became clear that the illness was not going to be a short story, we had made a decision together, a very quiet, very deliberate decision, about what that account would become. We had used it. We had spent it. We had spent a portion of it on Raymond's care in those 11 weeks, the private nursing, the medical equipment, the small dignities that insurance does not cover and that Raymond deserved. We had spent a portion of it in the years after, as my own care needs increased, and Raymond in the last week of his life, when he was still lucid and still himself beneath the diminishment of the illness, had told me to do something with what remained. He had said in his quiet way, "Don't save it for people who won't remember what it cost." I had promised him I would not. The remainder of that account, $127,000, I had donated in the year after my stroke to the library where I volunteered on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Not to the library system as a bureaucratic institution, but to a specific fund. The Raymond Calloway Early Literacy Fund, which paid for books and materials and after-school programs for children in the district who could not afford them. I had done this quietly, without announcement. The library had placed a small plaque, which I visited sometimes, and which made me cry in the productive, grateful way that is quite different from the other kinds of crying. Linda's lawyer found the donation records in the library's public financial filings, which Robert had anticipated they would do, and which is why Robert had, on my instruction, ensured that every aspect of that donation was perfectly documented, perfectly legal, and perfectly incontestable. The account was gone. The money was, in the precise legal sense, unreachable. It had been given to a public institution and had already been dispersed into programs running for several years. The chairs in the children's reading room had been purchased with some of that money. The after-school program that ran every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, teaching children to read, had been funded in part by it. It was gone, and it was gone beautifully, and there was not a single thing Linda or her lawyer could do about it. When Linda found this out, when her lawyer confirmed to her that the account no longer existed and that its former contents were permanently beyond reach, she came to find me in my kitchen where I was still sitting with my tea. She stood in the doorway, and she looked at me, and for a moment the performance was completely gone, and what I saw on her face was something I recognized from a very old place. From the face of the 7-year-old girl who had been fierce, the 12-year-old who had been tender, the 19-year-old who had been trying. It was the face of someone who has discovered that the world is not arranged for her benefit, and who does not know yet how to absorb that information. She said, "Did you plan all of this?" I said, "No. I planned the house. The library was your father's idea and mine." She said, "You gave away almost everything." I said, "I gave everything to where it belonged." She left without saying anything else. I heard the front door close, and then the car door, and then the sound of the engine, and then silence. I sat in my kitchen and I finished my tea. The maple threw leaf shadows across the window in the early spring light. I thought of Raymond and what he would have said, and I heard it in his particular voice, the voice of a man who measured his words and rarely wasted them. I thought he would have said, "Good." The legal proceedings concluded in the autumn of the following year. The deed was upheld in full. Sylvia Novak remained the owner-in-waiting of the house on Maple Creek Road. Linda's legal costs, and I was told this by Robert, not with any desire on my part for the information to be used as a weapon, but simply as a matter of record, were significant. She had engaged a firm that charged rates appropriate to the kind of case she thought she had, and when the case turned out to be something considerably less than what she had imagined, those rates did not decrease. I heard through David that she had borrowed against her condominium to pay the legal fees. I heard this without satisfaction, or with a satisfaction so complicated it did not feel like what satisfaction is supposed to feel like. I am telling you this part because I promised you. Financial karma, and I want to be accurate about what that means. It does not mean that Linda was destroyed or ruined in any dramatic sense. She was not. She is, as far as I know, still living in Chicago, still working, still maintaining the life she built. What happened is more precise than destruction. What happened is that she bet everything on a certainty that was not certain. She had calculated the value of her patience, the value of her strategic performance of concern, the value of the Sunday calls and the 3-day visits, and the carefully managed relationship with a mother whose house she intended to inherit. She had made that calculation with the confidence of someone who believes they have understood the situation completely, and what she discovered is that the situation contained information she had not included in her calculation. That is the nature of financial karma in real life. It is not dramatic, it is arithmetic. I am still living in my house on Maple Creek's Road. I am 73 years old as I tell you this. My health is what it is, managed, negotiated, not ungrateful. I take my medications and I see my doctors and I walk my 2 miles in the morning, slower now but still moving. The tremor in my left hand has become a familiar companion rather than an enemy. I have made a kind of peace with the body that is carrying me through this last portion of the journey. Sylvia is still across the street in the yellow house. We walk together in the morning when we are both up for it. She comes for tea on Wednesdays. She still brings bread occasionally, though I can bake it myself again on the good days. And sometimes I bring bread to her instead, which makes us both laugh in the particular way of two people who have lived long enough to find the reversals of life genuinely funny. Her daughter visited from Portland last summer, and we all had dinner on my porch on a warm July evening, and it was a good dinner, a comfortable and easy dinner, the kind of dinner you can only have with people who have nothing left to perform for each other. David came for Thanksgiving this year, with his wife and all 3 children. We ate at the big table Raymond built with lumber from a salvage yard in the spring of 1982. His youngest asked me to tell her about when her father was small, and I told her 3 stories that made David put his face in his hands and made everyone laugh, and it was the best Thanksgiving I can remember in a decade. Linda did not come. Linda has not come for Thanksgiving in 4 years. I have not closed the door on her. I want to be clear about that. I have not sent a letter cutting ties or made a declaration of estrangement. The door of this house remains, as it has always been, physically open to her. What I have stopped doing is performing, in the phone calls and the carefully worded holiday texts, a warmth I do not feel and a future that cannot be what I once hoped. If she wants to come, she can come. If she wants to call, she can call, and I will answer. But I will not pretend. I am too old and too clear-eyed and too near the end of things to pretend. What I want to tell you, in finishing this story, is the thing I have come to understand about the transfer of wealth and the inheritance of love. We talk about legacy in terms of what we leave behind: money, property, things that can be assessed and divided and fought over by lawyers in gray suits with document bags. But what I have discovered, in the living of this particular life and the making of these particular decisions, is that legacy is not the thing you leave. It is the story people carry about who you were. It is the shape your presence made in the lives of the people around you. Raymond left me a house I refinished on my hands and knees. He left me 35 years of a particular kind of steadiness, of a man who got up at 5 and fixed your car and held your hand without being asked. He left his oldest grandson the precise form of his gentleness. He left a children's reading room in the library of the town where he worked for 3 decades. That is a legacy that cannot be contested or divided or entered into a legal record. It simply is. And what I am leaving, the thing I have decided to leave, the shape of the story I want to carry forward from this house on Maple Creek Road, is this: that presence is worth more than property. That the woman who brings you bread when your hands won't work is worth more than the daughter who calculates the square footage. That love, in its true form, is not a strategy. It is not a patience deployed in the direction of an asset. It is something given without arithmetic, without expectation, without a ledger anywhere in sight. The deed is signed. The house is Sylvia's when the time comes. The reading room carries Raymond's name. The maple in the front yard has made it through another winter. I take my 2 miles every morning, and I come home to my kitchen, and I make tea, and I sit at the table where the hardest conversations of my life have taken place, and I am not afraid of anything that remains. There is one more thing I should tell you, something I have not told anyone except Robert Kessler and Sylvia and the mirror in my bathroom on a cold December morning when I first understood it fully. It is the thing that was in the envelope. The old envelope I mentioned once, early in this story in passing, almost as an aside. My son said once, in the early months of the legal challenge, that he did not know how I had known, in advance of everything, that the documents were coming. He asked me if someone had told me Linda was planning to bring the notary. I told him no, and that was true. No one had told me. But I had known, with the certainty of someone reading a story they have been told before, because I had found the envelope. 8 months before Linda arrived with Mr. Fitch on that Wednesday morning, I had been going through a box of Raymond's papers, old bills, old letters, the accumulated documentary life of a practical man, and I had found a letter that Linda had written to Raymond when she was 27 years old. A letter from before the internet age, when people still put difficult things on paper. A letter asking him, in the careful language of a person who had thought hard about how to phrase something they knew was wrong, whether he had ever considered leaving the house to her alone, given that she had plans and David had always been fine with less. Whether he had thought about what would happen to the property after, and here she used a phrase that had stayed with me across all the years since I first read it, after the situation resolved itself. Raymond had never responded to that letter in writing. There was no reply in the box, but he had kept the letter, which told me that he had read it and made a decision about it, the way Raymond made decisions, quietly, completely, without performance. He had kept it, and he had never told me about it, which I now believe was an act of protection, the kind of protection that costs the protector something. He knew what was in the letter, and he chose not to hand me a grief I was not ready for, not while we were still building our life, and Linda was still young enough to become someone different. She had not become someone different. When I found the letter, I sat on the floor of Raymond's study, the room I had barely touched since his death, and I held it in my hands for a long time. Then I put it back in the envelope, and I put the envelope in the drawer of my bedside table, where I kept the things I needed to remember. And I thought, Raymond knew. Raymond knew for 30 years, and he still got up at 5 every morning and held her hand at Christmas and drove her to the airport and called her on her birthdays. Not because he was naive, because he had decided that the fact of what she was did not change what he was. That is a form of grace I aspire to and do not fully possess. But I also kept the letter, and when Robert needed documentation of a long-standing pattern of behavior toward the estate, when the legal proceedings required evidence of intent that predated the Wednesday in November, that letter, in Linda's own 27-year-old handwriting, from a time before she had learned to perform her calculations more carefully, became part of the file. I told you there were things Linda did not know. I told you she had not expected certain things. The letter was one of them. The thing she did not know was that her own father had kept it, that the man she had been strategic with for 30 years had understood, with his particular quiet clarity, exactly what she was, and had loved her anyway, and had left behind, without intending to, the very evidence that would one day make his wife's legal case. That is the whole story. That is how a house worth nearly $2 million moved across the street to a woman who brought bread and drove to the hospital and sat in difficult silences without needing anything in return. That is how a reading room got built in a library in Ohio with the name of a man who got up at 5 every morning and fixed your car before you knew it needed fixing. That is how the arithmetic of love, when you practice it long enough and honestly enough, produces results that no notary can alter and no inheritance challenge can contest. I am still here. I am still walking my 2 miles. The maple is budding again. And if anyone asks what I would do differently, if anyone in the comments of this story or in the quiet of their own kitchen at 3 a.m. wants to know whether I regret it, I will tell them what Raymond would have said. Not a single word of it.